So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Nickel. I'm a sixth-year candidate here in the Department of Music. And it's my honor to introduce our guest this evening, Professor and Reverend Dr. Alisha Lola Jones, who joins us from Indiana University, Bloomington, where she is an assistant professor of ethnomusicology in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, with affiliate or adjunct status in several other departments. This breadth of appointments bespeaks her breadth of research and practice, ranging across Afro-diasporic religious musics, Western European art music, global pop music, masculinities and men's studies, the music industry and arts entrepreneurship, and gastromusicology. Her work shows a dedication to ethnographic depth and a commitment to taking seriously the practices of her interlocutors, often ones she herself practices as well. Professor Jones's music analytical skills and her keen ear for vocal meaning mean that her work speaks to both music and non-music scholars equally well. In particular, her innovative connections between Black music and Black foodways have sparked new collaborations at IU and beyond. Professor Jones has published on many of these topics in esteemed journals and edited collections. Her forthcoming book is called Flaming: The Peculiar Theopolitics of Fire and Desire in Black Male Gospel Performance, and will be published with Oxford University Press. I had the great pleasure of meeting Alisha when she was finishing up her degree at Chicago several years ago. As an early graduate student, I always appreciated the time she would take with me at conferences to catch up, exchange ideas, and unwind, even amidst job applications and postdoc interviews. I believe she is the rare scholar who knows how to play the games that academia requires while also keeping it real and grounded, and her research and practice are the stronger for it. So it is with gratitude that I welcome our guest this evening, Professor Alisha Lola Jones, for her talk entitled When and Where I Enter: Marian Anderson, Florence B. Price, and a Womanist Musical Rebuttal of UnSisterly White Women's Movements. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Wow. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that. Can I keep that? That was like lovely. That was nothing I have. Wow. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the friendship that you extended in such a gesture. Thank you so much. I was actually thinking about this opportunity and how, on some level, I feel like this is my home that I never visited, because my advisor went here, my dissertation advisor went here, and always spoke highly of his formation here, Dr. Melvin Butler, and then so many folks who are on faculty here and who attend the school remain conversation partners and collaborators, of course. Dr. Marian is an ongoing collaborator who I appreciate and who in many ways models a sort of public-facing scholarship that I aspire toward, and Dr. Cusick as well. There is a roll call, and because I'm a preacher, I know not to, go down the roll call because I don't want people to be offended, but I feel the love, I know the love, and I view you all as family. So today I would like to share with you research that is the basis for my second book-length project that will be towards a womanist ethnomusicology. This is by no means an exhaustive introduction to womanism. I kind of feel like I'm in the backyard of womanist thought, because Union Theological Seminary is that place where you can really delve into what's at stake, especially for religious networks with regard to womanism. But here I offer a womanist listening practice through this piece of research. Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me. That's Anna Julia Cooper from A Voice from the South, 1882, a very, very important quote. When will we listen to Black women? Was the rallying cry echoed throughout the streets in journalistic think pieces and on social media in 2016, 2017. These reactions followed the polling results revealing Black women's collective voting power in arguably the most contentious elections in the 21st century thus far. In an era of Black women-founded movements such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Say Her Name, some use messianic language to characterize them as saving the day, despite being marginalized in various predominantly white women's movements. Thought leaders are noticing the socio-political inaudibility of Black women, liberators highlighting the bias woven into the fabric of the US popular imagination. However, this socio-political observation does not account for Black women's agency and ingenuity in creating spaces for themselves in musical performance and quotidian life throughout history. Prompted by activist Anna Julia Cooper's famous quote as a womanist ethnomusicological framework of utterance, say, sing, time, when, space, where, and access, enter, this presentation constructs a genealogy of Black women's audibility strategies by answering the questions: in what ways have Black women empowered themselves to sound the unquieted, undisputed dignity of womanhood on the world stage? Despite Black women's persistent socio-political inaudibility, especially in the US, women's suffrage movements, contralto Marian Anderson's narrative reveals a longstanding legacy of Black women embodying and amplifying Black women-composed works, as evidenced by her 1939 recital in Washington, D.C., that many of us are very familiar with. A historical moment that is being revisited by scholars and artists right now. One artist I can think of who is New York-based is Damian Sneed, who we were talking about earlier. He has just announced, or it was just announced recently, that he has a new chamber opera debuting at the Houston Grand Opera in March 2020 called Marian's Song, depicting that particular historical moment. Although she was refused concert space at the Daughters of the American Revolution at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., Anderson accepted Howard University and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt's invitation to perform for the Howard University benefit concert at the Lincoln Memorial. Anderson displayed Black sisterhood when she closed the concert with an arranged composition of the Negro spiritual, My Soul is Anchored in the Lord. Now let's get caught up through Keynote. So this is an iconic photograph, and you will notice her attire, which I will discuss a little bit later, the significance of that attire. And this is advertisement of that chamber opera I mentioned earlier. And here is pictured Anderson with Lady Roosevelt. So as Anderson invoiced Price's composition as the final say on the moment, she provided a musical rebuttal through which both Anderson and Price entered into the concert domains predominantly comprised of white male decision makers and exclusionist industry bolstered by UnSisterly white women patrons that stemmed from an untethered colonial past of chattel slavery plantation hierarchy. In my analysis, I resist the white savior narrative that places First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt at the center of the triumph. Much attention has been given to Roosevelt's resignation from the DAR as a member in good standing. However, it is not well known that her resignation was almost 2 months after Anderson was declined from the venue. Historian Alita in Black contends that Roosevelt's maneuver was intended to make it a national and not just a personal event. Instead of centering the narrative on Roosevelt's participation, I use a womanist analysis, that which prizes speaking for oneself, and I take seriously the prism of race, gender, and sexuality, and even class, to consider the ways in which Anderson's performance of woman-composed Negro spirituals exemplifies her collaboration as an intersectional gesture consistent with Black nationalist aims, Christian spirituality, and African-derived musical signifying. Earlier this year, I had the great pleasure of joining a collection of scholars in commemorating the life and work of native Arkansas composer Florence B. Price at the University of Arkansas, where Dr. Jing Kong debuted some of her obscure concert work for violin. There was a showing of the documentary The Caged Bird, the life and music of Florence B. Price from 2015. I would like to take a look at a clip from the documentary, a trailer, and if we could view it together with attention to how we might center a Black woman's perspective in thinking about hearing and listening to that 1939 recital. Let's take a look.
Sunday, 19th, Marian Anderson was invited to sing before parental 1,000 in front of Lincoln Memorial. Hundreds of thousands of radio. This electrifying event was the watershed moment in history, a national attention to the country's color bearer. No other event had previously. Anderson's final song that day was composed by native Florence B. This was not the only brush with greatness. Her parents welcomed Frederick Douglass to their home. As a young mother, Florence corresponded with W.E.B. Later still, she collaborated with Hughes, James Wright, dancer Catherine Dunham. Pinnacle of her life's work, the musician and composer must have been that night in 1933 when the world-famous Chicago Symphony, consisting entirely of white men, mirrored her symphony in C minor at the Chicago World's Fair. And today, this is a huge achievement for any composer. At that time, it was entirely without precedent. Music written by an African-American woman, presented by a prestigious orchestra, such a
Oh, kind of like class. What did we hear and see? Any thoughts? Anyone want to share anything? Anything strike you as interesting, especially in the narrative? Yeah.
The marshaling of so many instruments of political power.
Okay.
Right, and legitimacy, right?
Right. And what?
Fair nationalism, right?
Right. And what were the entities that were legitimizing? White men. The pinnacle was having white men perform her music. Yeah, her life was white men. Isn't that interesting? Not being called by the First Lady or Howard University, but white men. Yeah, you heard rightly. Yes, this is interesting, striking. The narrator says the apex of Price's career was narrated as being when her symphony in E minor was debuted by the all-white male orchestra at the Chicago Symphony, revealing the white male-centered bias of the documentary producers. And this is not the only way that it's been narrated, but this is the predominant way that it has been narrated. However, I beg to differ and submit that Anderson's 1939 recital might arguably be the pinnacle of her career if she had to have one sort of blip in her career. Anderson set the stage for African American women to rebut white women's unsisterly role in erecting barriers to their full experience of womanhood. The DAR's refutation of Black women's patriotism as descendants of people who died for this country, and white women's suffragists' exploitation of Black women's lack of access to full rights of citizenship through desegregated education, suffrage, artistry, and patronage. Bolstered by a web of Black women inclusive networks, Black churches, Black women's clubs, Howard University, the NAACP, the National Association of Negro Musicians, Anderson ascended to the stage, voicing Price's composition as a form of musicalized collective responsibility. For decades, it was common practice for venues to be lenient about Jim Crow enforcement in DC. In spite of this custom, the manager, Fred Hand, on behalf of the Daughters of the American Revolution, would not permit Anderson to perform in their 4,000-seat Constitution Hall on the grounds of a dormant whites-only policy that was resurrected following two 1931 concerts by Black artists without Jim Crow seating in 1931. And so the seating was segregated. The patrons, the African-American patrons, could only sit in one section. And around 1931, Roland Hayes and others had the stipulation that if they were to perform at the DAR, it could not be segregated. And so this was Fred Hand's a response to those requests. Accompanied by pianist Kosti Vihanen, her oral visual musical performance was sonorous and beautiful, unquieting in the federal public square, the traditional images of African-American ladyhood that were so often constrained by socio-political codes of respectability. Musically, her contralto fach signified on the rare and extended vocal range explored through Black vocalities. Her voice traversed masculinized lower treble to bass timbral realms, metaphorically deployed as an inter- and intercultural tool. Women's studies scholar Treva Lindsay uses the voice metaphorically here to capture women speaking and advocating for themselves, as she writes, quote, "And yet this voice took shape in the performance of strategic, quiet, feminine propriety, feminine artifice, and restorative equanimity," end quote. Interculturally, her concert repertoire signified on the socio-cultural versatility of Black womanhood, despite anti-Blackness in every U.S. industry. Expanding on Lindsay's observation, I hear the 1939 recital as the moment in which Black women moved from strategic performance of quiet bodily aesthetics of ladyhood to what I call vocalized femininity as an intentional public protest. The nation encountered Anderson's voice through a radio broadcast that began with this announcement under the auspices of Howard University in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're speaking to you from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in the nation's capital, from which point the National Broadcasting Company brings you a song recital by the gifted Marian Anderson, considered by music critics throughout the world as possessing a most outstanding contralto voice. This concert is presented under the auspices of Howard University of Washington, D.C. Miss Anderson will sing from a stage built on the steps of this impressive memorial to America's Civil War president, looking out over the beautiful reflecting pool of the Washington Monument. Marian Anderson is singing this public concert at the Lincoln Memorial because she was unable to get an auditorium to accommodate a tremendous audience that wished to hear her. Thousands are gathered near the memorial to hear this Easter Day recital, which is perhaps the first open-air concert ever held in Washington. Miss Anderson will...
Oh, yes. So situating her in front of the Lincoln Memorial, it is not lost on me that while the secretary referred to Anderson as a daughter of the race from which the chains of slavery were stricken, he simultaneously reinscribed the problematic colonial perception of Black women as either a credit to their race or daughters of the plantation that we hear of in Alex Haley's Queen, which places them among this country's places her among this country's forefathers with his inclusion of Thomas Jefferson in his roll call for that day. His evocation of the plantation connotes an apropos site of inquiry, but it is still a slightly or blatantly imprecise description of the extent to which Anderson, as a Black woman, is disinherited as a descendant of enslaved Africans in the US. That colonial hierarchy of the plantation established the racial and hued caste system of women's rights, elevating white women's personhood and chastity above all other women. Those vestiges still exist to this day, unchecked. New research such as Dr. Stephanie Jones Rogers' book, I don't know if you all have seen the new press about it, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. It's being held up there with Toni Morrison's work right now that just came out, The Source of Self-Regard. In this book, she tackles the overlooked and forgotten social arrangements rooted in this particular legacy, where Black women and their families were literally the property of white women. So the secretary says, genius, like justice, is blind. In other words, genius is not seen or visualized. It is reasoned, it is heard. Anderson's political intervention required sound, and yet she looked the part of Black womanhood. Her hair neatly finger-waved and pinned into place, chromatic colors, and a mink fur coat. The luxurious wardrobe item of the fur coat in particular is a multi-referent to Black ladyhood, achievement, posterity, evoking a, quote, rarely recognized ritual in the African American community, one in which older Black women pass their expensive coats on to younger women in their family and friendship circles as a gentle way to affirm the younger woman's elegance and grace. Recently, journalist Lolly Bowen wrote in her article that in a way, quote, in a way, passing down a fur coat is a modest gesture to prophesize a life of opulence, grandeur for a younger woman. And this was her quoting Tanisha C. Ford, an associate professor of Africana Studies and History at the University of Delaware, whose new book, Dressed in Dreams, looks at the politics of Black fashion. Dr. Ford goes on to say, at a time when segregation was still the law of the land and de facto the law onward, for a Black woman to walk outside her house in something that was as luxurious and glamorous and that was normally designated for a white woman, it was a big deal, Ford said. This country was legally telling Black women they were inferior in every realm of society otherwise, end quote. At a glance, her printed recital signals a conventional recital programming of Western European art music repertoire. And I think I have it here for you all. Yes. And coincidentally, I want to say that this particular image, though I found the actual program, this particular image was included in a children's book. They had primary sources in it. And I just put that up there just because in many ways, children's books can be the site of actual rigorous research and resources. So I just thought that was interesting. So at a glance, her printed recital looks like what we would expect of a particular concert of Western European art music. Throughout the literature about this moment, though, writers have emphasized her opening and closing with America and the Star-Spangled Banner. In fact, if you look for recordings from this recital, the Star-Spangled Banner and America are what people emphasize. You don't see it in its entirety. And I think this is important, again, for similar reasons. Yes, it is a way of indicating her patriotism, despite the indignity of racial segregation that brought her there. The first half of the recital featured famous surnames. On the right side, we see Donizetti, we see Schubert, and then there is an intermission. The announcer described the legislative dignitaries present, placing the contentious political climate front and center, and I think I skipped over that moment. I'll let you hear that since it seems to be interesting.
Distinguished guests, Ladies and gentlemen, in this great auditorium,
Or, let me see. Here it is, sorry.
distinguished guests. Among the sponsors and among the distinguished guests, we see the Secretary of the Interior, the Honorable Harold Ickes, who introduced Miss Anderson, and we see Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, Senator Robert Wagner, Senator Joseph Guffey, Senator Arthur Capper sitting on the far side of the concert stage with Senator Clark of Missouri and Senator Capper there with him. In just a few moments, we hope to have an official estimate of this crowd for you. But a picture of this memorial. The memorial rises against a brilliant blue sky that is now just softening slightly by the approaching dusk. In the very light mist is coming up from the historic postament to the rear and around to our right here. The scene from the steps, here where we are standing, is perhaps the most breathtaking in all of the nation's capitals. The steps go down from the memorial to the reflection pool, and we can see mirrored in its surface the entire height of the Washington Monument that stands at the other end of the pool about 1/2 mile from us. And far in the distance, we see a portion of the majestic.
So this particular description sets the stage, literally and figuratively, not only for Anderson's performance, but it echoes for the next 2 decades, 3 decades or so, in terms of monumental, literally, moments such as the I Have a Dream speech that would take place in that vicinity. On the second half of the program, Anderson prepared music by African American composers featuring her friends, Burley, Boatner, and then it indicates Florence Price. Burley, Boatner, then Florence Price. The Negro spirituals arranged compositions were true to the HBCU, Historically Black College and University, fundraising tradition. Of course, here I'm evoking Fisk Jubilee singers and all of the Jubilee ensembles that followed them that used the concertized spiritual as a part of not only the creation of a national repertoire, but also a means through which fundraising was made. Price's name is listed in full, revealing her gender and suggesting that she may be a composer to watch, which supports my argument that this performance should be viewed as a high point, a debut of sorts, nationally and internationally for this Black woman composer. Intraculturally, Anderson performed the communal goals of what one would call shared responsibility and collective freedom that Treva Lindsay writes about in her work. Price's composition was tailored commentary on the undisputed significance of the moment, emphasizing the centrality of God, community, and in voicing Black womanhood and sisterhood. Encapsulating the truest expression of the African concept, Ubuntu, I am because we are, she, as one, represented the spiritual clarity of many. And here I think I have her recording, singing Florence Price, pictured on the far right. Her arrangement of My Soul is Anchored in the Lord. I would love to listen to it at length, but I know we have time constraints. This song conveys her piety. However, upon closer inspection of the context and web of tradition, Black church, HBCU, mother wit that she signifies on, there's a deeper meaning. Price tapped into and tailored for Anderson witty commentary on that moment, echoing the wisdom of Black heroine Harriet Tubman, who once said, quote, "Oh, dear Lord, I ain't got no friend but you," end quote. Price, through Anderson, asserted in whom she ultimately put her trust, the Lord, while gesturing toward the aesthetic networks that brought her to this point by invoicing Price's composition. Her God-fearing family, Black churches, various civic and education organizations all got her there, and they were all indicated on the program, on the backside of the program, and announced through the radio station. But in the popular commentary, all of those folks are sort of swallowed up in First Lady Roosevelt's participation. Her evocation of being anchored is imagery consistent with stillness and rootedness, quietude of the body, indicative of ladyhood, and the proper concert stance of vocalists trained to sing without amplification. Soul symbolizes personhood. Mountain represents one's transcendence above the indignity or hell of segregation. More than patriotism, though, this performance was true to a Black nationalistic agenda and her personal spirituality. That's a key distinction here. The emphasis on the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner as simply patriotism also overlooks her Black nationalistic affiliations. To analyze the significance of Anderson's repertoire selection and the politics of programming sonic African-American ladyhood in this historical moment, we must take into account correspondence from everyday sisterhood, the Black church oral tradition, African-American recital tradition, and radio broadcasting, which includes Western European concert music recordings. Marian Anderson's papers in the University of Pennsylvania's library display her correspondence with Price, and it actually includes a letter referring to the song, "My Soul is Anchored in the Lord." We see in their holdings the wire transfer correspondence between Florence Price and Marian Anderson. And you can see the notation within it that gives us an indication the purpose of these sort of tailored compositions. And then the more straightforward correspondence is in this last letter here. The others are just correspondence about compositions that they were working on together. But "My Soul is Anchored in the Lord" is indicated right here in Marian Anderson's handwriting, and they're talking about how they want the setting to be finalized. This is a wonderful treasure within the papers. But this sort of everyday correspondence helps us to think about the intentionality of including these musical works. In Marian Anderson's papers, Margaret Cruesi documents, quote, "Approximately a third of the composers who sent manuscripts to Anderson for her consideration were women." So it was widely known that Anderson wanted to be a sonic safe space, if you will, for Black women composers and debut them in prestigious venues, not only in our federal public squares, but abroad in front of royalty. The volume of women's compositions in her collection evidences that Anderson's impact was more than a tastemaker and a culture bearer. She was a liberator, using the culturally relevant tool of music making to facilitate Black women traversing the imagined feminine domestic domains and audaciously leaping into the masculine domain of composition for the concert stage at the time. Among those letters, we also see correspondence posthumously between Price's daughter and Anderson, thanking Anderson for the sort of royalties that came from her continued singing of Price's material. And that is interesting because of the many ways in which performers don't get those sort of forms of passive and intangible streams of income beyond performance. Anderson and Price overcame countless race and gendered barriers to create the music that their soul loved, barriers that African American women still face in the concert music industry and in their homes. Anderson's earliest nurturing music education was through her paternal family's Union Baptist Church in Philadelphia. She was exposed to African American concert greats such as Roland Hayes and Harry T. Burleigh at a very early age. All three of them would go on to institutionalize the composition and performance of Negro spirituals throughout the world as an expression of Black nationalism. She experienced an interracial cultural shock when she was turned away from admittance into a school by a white woman registrar because she was a colored girl. Contending with the common heteropatriarchal perception that a woman's place is within the home, similarly for much of Price's career, her talent as a composer had been outright rejected in the major concert music venues due to her gender and race. When she sought formal education at the New England Conservatory in Boston, there were very few conservatories that would admit colored students. And my colleague Douglas Shadle would offer also that there is a lot of evidence to support the idea that in many ways Price and her family presented her as racially ambiguous, supplying her with domestic help so as to be viewed as perhaps of Latina ancestry, so she could move about the conservatory and matriculate. And that could be talked about at length. While early on, she won the Casper Holstein's Opportunity, a Negro Journal of Life magazine music competition, and music competitions through magazines was popular at the time. It would be several years before she would win national predominantly white competitions. Through personal and professional networks such as the Chicago chapter of the National Association of Negro Musicians, it was mostly Black women conductors and performers such as her mother, Florence Gulliver, her music teacher, Charlotte Stevens, pianist Margaret Bonds, and choreographer Catherine Dunham, Swedish American conductor Eva Sundstrom of the Chicago Women's Symphony, and vocalist Marian Anderson, who programmed Price's music and gave voice to her music despite the barriers that she faced. Although reviewer Robert S. Abbott described her eventual 1933 debut that we heard about at the beginning of this lecture at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra under the baton of Frederick A. Stock as emblematic of her Americanness, Price undoubtedly used cultural folk idioms to illustrate her Black nationalist identity that embraced what Salamisha Tillett refers to as an African-American critical patriotism, championed by women suffragist leaders such as Mary Church Terrell. And I will get us to her. This is the magazine that Florence Price, won a music competition through. And this is Mary Church Terrell, who often went head-to-head with some of the iconic figures that we would name who pioneered women's suffrage. She was actually in conversations with them and sort of filled in what was not being said about negotiations for Black women getting the vote. Price met Anderson in the 1930s, presumably through Margaret Bond's family. They found refuge, exposure, and collaborative partners in Black musician affinity groups such as the National Association of Negro Musicians. Public music education has long been a culturally relevant means through which talented African Americans could pursue education. Musicologist Eileen Southern has most appropriately identified her alongside other Black nationalist figures such as Harry T. Burleigh and Marian Anderson. What all of these vocal recitalists had in common was their use of African American spirituals in their performances, strategically asserting the national identity of folks of African ancestry here in the US. Price went on to tailor 50 art songs and arrangements for Anderson. 50. So again, their relationship was very, very important, especially from Price's end of the bargain. In fact, following that Lincoln Memorial recital, Anderson closed her recitals often with that selection, "My Soul is Anchored in the Lord." Tenor Roland Hayes was regarded as an early influence to Anderson. He established the practice of closing recitals with Negro spirituals, African American art, and folk compositions. Black musicians' placement of the Black folk tradition alongside other folk traditions was a strategy for performing personhood on the world stage. NAM's seasonal public arts education is an important intervention in making sure that these artists use that practice in furthering these nationalistic aims throughout the socio-political landscape, extending to the sphere of Black women's suffrage when various individuals would host salons of musical performances of this music. Black people's movement, visibility, and music in the public squares of Washington, D.C. is attached to a long legacy of law, surveillance, censorship, and power struggle. Black women's politics of willful presence, movement, and collective visibility are demonstrated and worked out on myriad concert stages in Washington, D.C. The Resurrection Day recital was not the first effort to reclaim the national racial landscape there. For example, cultural anthropologist Kira Gaunt recently stated in research on Porgy and Bess that lead performers Ann Brown and Todd Duncan protested the National Theater's segregated audience policy. Quote, the 1935 premiere of Porgy and Bess happened just 15 years after women gained the legal right to vote in the US. However, the legal system of Jim Crow segregation had a female counterpart. African American women in many states of the South were unable to freely exercise their right to vote until as late as 1960. This meant that someone like contralto Marian Anderson from Philadelphia was probably able to vote, but women such as soprano Leontine Price, who grew up in Laurel, Mississippi, were not fully allowed to vote, end quote. Gaunt rightly situates musical performance alongside women's suffrage. The Roosevelt involvement was an instant evocation of white support of Black suffrage and desegregation. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt fought for universal suffrage through the Progressive Party and lost the presidential election to Woodrow Wilson. The recently deceased historian Rosalind Turberg Penn wrote, quote, elite white women reformers sought to address intemperance, political corruption, inadequate economic and educational opportunities for women, crime, and limited consumer protection, end quote, through these efforts. They did not include racial discrimination and the plight of disenfranchised Black women in their priorities for social reform. Progressively, as these talks occurred around suffrage, a chasm widened between white and Black women. Since the 1890s, though, Black women established their own social clubs to have their say and to create safe spaces for discussing their issues. Quote, Black women lacked access to the protected status of ladyhood and its accompanying privileges for white women suffragists and women's rights activists. Ladyhood signaled the policing of their bodies and the relegation of their bodies to private and semi-private spheres, end quote. In the tug of war between white women and Black women for the right to vote, suffrage became a gendered debate in which an ultimatum was offered. There was a choice in the debate between the order of rights being granted to white women and or Black men, or it could just be Black men with white men retaining primacy in these discussions. The NAACP was instrumental in serving the interests of Black people, using the press as their primary tool to put these issues front and center. African-American writer Adela Hunt Logan denounced those men who claimed to love the principles of the American Revolution, but failed to apply these principles to women. W.E.B. Du Bois challenged suffrage leaders who criticized Blacks for opposing women's suffrage, but not whites who opposed enfranchising Black men and women. Eventually, Henry Blackwell proposed what is called educated suffrage to eliminate Black women voters and to exclude ignorant Black men. These are his words. which included using literacy tests to limit Black and foreign-born voters. This strategy suppressed the working class efforts and provoked Black men to push for a 19th Amendment that supported excluding no women. Treva Lindsay writes further, quote, new Negro women suffragists wanted to have their own voice as African-American women within the national body politic. With greater access to mass media outlets such as newspapers and other periodicals, new Negro suffragists capitalized upon a longstanding strategy in Black women's activism to situate themselves as modern activists, end quote. I agree here with Lindsay that their resistance strategies encompassed disruptive possibilities and add that Anderson used her sounded voice to claim the sociopolitical and mass-mediated soundscape, not just in that live performance, but also including the radio performance where her music was broadcasted. As I draw to a close, I want to just say that Howard University made an intervention by producing an educated, politically savvy community of Black women who recognize the importance of the politics of appearance. According to suffragist Mary Church Terrell, these women's attributes were that they were the most brainiest, cultured, and virtuous of the community. They sought advancement of women in all industries and the public square, including landmarks like the Lincoln Memorial, and this is where they put their money. These were the other entities that actually financed this particular moment. In addition to the influence on appearance and visual style, HU also shaped sonic culture as a presenting organization for the Anderson Benefit Concert, which was consistent with their investment in political celebrities since its founding. The Daughters of the American Revolution Constitution Hall was a concert space that symbolized a sphere of musical, concertized ladyhood to the exclusion of Black women, and Howard University arose to remedy that silencing. And yet, in 1939, Anderson and Price reclaimed ladyhood at the recital hall, at the Lincoln Memorial under the sky, and symbolically, all flesh heard it together. There is a newer cultural critique that is widely distributed called "They love our culture and don't love us." The phrase points to the unchecked colonial prerogative in which hegemonic or dominant culture grabs and profits off of Black people's products and innovations without proper credit, while being disinterested in their lives, in particular, Black women's lives. We see this in the Me Too movement that turned into Time's Up, erasing the Black woman founder of the movement who conceptualized the sonically cued empathy with the phrase Me Too. This cultural mining, hypocrisy, and theft isn't new. However, technology permits the covetous to take the signature physical and sonic attributes of Black women's oral visual culture, all the while deriding them, overlooking them, and systematically engineering their demise. One of the most insidious and circulated stereotypes is that women of African descent are given to same-gender rivalry along the lines of hue, color, interracial parentage, socioeconomic, and education status. And to this day, for quite some time really, women of African descent have been frequently misrepresented in music and culture as being irrational, shallow, unkind, and unsisterly, especially when we are challenged by each other in heated debates. Through multimedia, harmful and imprecise depictions of women of African descent are rapidly crisscrossing the planet. The images like what we saw of Marian Anderson, shaping popular perceptions of their intellectual capacity in their absence. These stereotypes are simply untrue. These are projections, yet here we are. We submit our lives to explore the complexity of identities and connections as practitioner scholars whose lives have been inscribed and are read for tensions surrounding post-colonialism. Therefore, I assert here, It is a transgressive political and pedagogical act for women of the African diaspora to collaborate like Anderson and Price did, to borrow from Anna Julia Cooper, quote, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of their womanhood, without violence, without suing, or special patronage. Anderson and Price are example of a long-standing tradition of Black women making music with each other. These women were tastemakers, finding space to create despite other daughters' unsisterliness. And as we breeze through this digital age, the Black women-founded movement Say Her Name beckons us to utter their names, sounding their signatures, like music to our ears, to undo with music what socio-political inaudibility has done. Thank you. So I believe I have permission to field questions, if any. Of course, like any lecturer, there's so much you want to say and so little time. Yes.
I wanted to follow up on the remarks you made about Florence Price and her mother's desire for her, in some sense, to pass.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm thinking about is I read recently also that a rift developed between Florence Price and her mother because her mother did end up passing and basically disowning her family in order to pass as wife.
Mm-hmm.
And so in thinking about this kind of tragic break within a family, fragmentation of a family under the extreme stresses
Mm-hmm.
that family endured, especially in Arkansas, and given what had happened with the decimation of Black businesses and life in Little Rock, which affected her family in this very intense way. Thinking about that in relationship to the importance of the bond that she established with Marian Anderson,
Mm-hmm.
which seems to have been, I mean, I'm under the impression that it was one of the few bonds, like one of the most important bonds for her
Mm-hmm.
professionally and personally, though you have a better.
Yeah, so thank you. And you rightly point out the significance of where she was born, because she was raised with people like William Grant Still, right? You know, so again, another indicator of these sort of Black nationalistic values and trying to figure out what a U.S. folk tradition is. Indigenous musics being used by indigenous people as well as descendants of Africans in the U.S. So with regard to her relationship with her mother, what I'm aware of is less an emphasis on her mother. She was an educator. There's often more an emphasis on her father. And I would say that what her mother did in terms of helping her to get access, especially in today's climate of what parents do, to make sure that to make sure their children get access, for a gifted child, no less, a gifted child, not a fraudulent. Okay, so what her mother did is not, it's common, you know what I mean, in terms of strategizing about getting access to one of the few places that presented itself as admitting musicians and artists of color. So I resist making it remarkable. I would actually be curious though, like if I could make a trinity out of this, because I'm religious, you know, I would put Margaret Bonds in there, you know, because when Florence got divorced, her husband was underemployed, had a series of bad luck, if you want to use that term, and she ended up moving to Chicago. But for Margaret Bonds' family, her and her mother, Florence Price would not have had a place to stay. or salons to do her work, networks to sort of start to build her notoriety. So I would put Margaret Bonds in there. But thank you for that softball toss, because I mean, her mother did what a lot of mothers do, I see. Does that answer your question a little bit? Yes. And
Thank
then
you
you.
so much. I have two questions. One picks up on this slide a little bit. Because the setting of this concert, the wider setting of this recital is, of course, DC. And DC is this fascinating city that has so much problematic history in it. And I was just, while you were speaking about DC a little earlier, I was just looking up to confirm what I had thought. In 1940, DC was minority black. In 1970, DC was majority black. And in 2010, it became minority black again because of this wave of gentrification that swept through the city.
And it's my home city.
Oh, that's so interesting. I didn't know that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it meant and whether you know anything about the composition of the audience of that recital in terms of what it might have meant for especially for Marian Anderson. And I was unclear if Florence Price was at the recital or not, but
No,
okay,
no.
she wasn't there.
But Anderson's mother and sister was.
I wonder whether you can divine what kind of audience would have been able to show up in that kind of public space, given the way that DC was a majority white city at that time, and how that might have influenced the feel that because you gave us so much of the feel of the concert through playing the recordings, how it might have influenced the feel, and that's the first question.
Good, and actually, you give me an opportunity to point to something that I love to bring into the classroom, actually, which is a primary document called the Black Codes of DC. So the condition for her to do the performance was that it would be desegregated. So there were no segregated sections like what would have been. And the reach, they said it was like 70,000 in attendance. DAR is 4,000. You know, God brings the increase, I guess, you know. And so I like to think, though, about your question also through Black Codes that stayed in effect until 1977. You could easily Google this. It's a great primary document to kind of give people a sense of the connections between race and leisure and more broadly music making. But at the time, beyond the sort of the makeshift performance space of the Lincoln Memorial, it was prohibited for gatherings of 2 or 3 black people till 1979. Like on the dawn of Mayor Marion Barry's inauguration, okay? So, and he will forever be mayor for Washingtonians. But it was prohibited. It was prohibited to bathe in the lake that was nearby, the lake nearby. It was prohibited to fly kites. It was also prohibited to sell liquor for Negroes to sell liquor, to do house parties, and to be freed upon conversion. So there were a lot of interesting laws still in effect 40 years after that could have been enforced beyond the parameters of that segregated space, and also shaped the nightlife, the performance life of Washingtonians who lived there every day.
My second question was about the reception of the sort of whitewashing that occurred in the credit to Eleanor Roosevelt for having orchestrated this event. I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at primary sources from the black press. And like, what did the Amsterdam News write up? You had a sense of whether they were more keen on the role that Howard University played, but whether they even maybe got to the kind of thesis that you're putting forward here about the importance of sisterly actions within the black community that made this possible. If you had a sense of whether those things were more salient for the sort of national level black press.
So the Crisis, which is the journalistic arm of the NAACP, and the NAACP was one of the major presenting organizations, would be the first place that I would go for that, as well as the Afro-American. There was coverage in the Howard University journalistic outlets, their radio, as well as periodicals. The Crisis, because they were a presenting organization and had championed it nationally, as well as the Afro-American, which is still in circulation today. There would be another sort of complexity with regard to gender, intraculturally, though, yeah. Emphasizing Boatner, Burley, their inclusion in the recital, yeah. May I do 1, 2, 3? Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope this is a question. I was kind of hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit more about dignity, which seems like a kind of critical term in that Anna Julia Cooper quote. In particular, Brittany Cooper writes about dignity being distinct from respect. Respect being, kind of requiring external validation. Like kind of what the standard narrative seems to be in terms of Marian Anderson. And I was kind of wondering about dignity, being an internal sort of thing, and if you see dignity in this example being merely internal or something that's maybe constituted through relationships between Black women, like Florence Price and Marian Anderson. So does that make sense?
I'm gonna try to go toward it. The imagery and what I know of Anderson's story, I'll start there. Marian Anderson is well known among formerly trained Black singers like myself as being a sisterly and motherly woman. We might refer to her, where I'm from, as an auntie, in the sense that she was a quiet patron of women for years, giving of her own wardrobe as well as financially making ways for women. And so a part of the tension that we know about this moment as it occurred and not just after was that by this time, Marian Anderson had sung for royalty around the world. And to face this indignity, being barred from the nation's capital to sing in such a close proximity to heads of state it didn't make sense. She had sung around the world for kings and queens and stayed and vacationed with them, like literally was coming off a vacation from such an opportunity to do this sort of recital. So it was clear to her the indignity of this sort of slight by such an organization that claim, peak patriotism. Again, I would just say that Marian Anderson, like if you ask a Denise Graves or Kathleen Battle, women who are 2 generations out, I'll even claim some residual from it, they will say that her generosity and thoughtfulness, remembrance of women like her was far-reaching, especially as a woman who was a deserving youth growing up in Philadelphia, quite conscious of those things. Does that get to it? Sort of.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I was, yes, I think it does. Yeah.
We can continue the conversation. Yes.
Thanks so much for focusing on this moment. And I guess I agree with you that it is a pinnacle moment, but I still want to go back to the E minor symphony.
Yeah.
I'm a great lover of E minor symphonies, and there was a tradition because Brahms was the grandfather, but then Dvorak wrote his E minor symphony.
Which is an interesting person to name.
To try to one of the things he wanted to do was to show that the future of American music should be Black. But then 2 years later, Amy Beach writes, a white woman writes an E minor symphony, and her point is to show that it doesn't have to be Black. It can be repressively Anglo-Saxon, as they were saying in Boston. So I think, I wonder when Florence Price she is making a very strong statement, both about reinscribing blackness into the American symphony, but also taking it away from Dvorak as well in an authentic way. So I just wonder whether you might go along with me in considering, after that beautiful image of the mink coat,
Yeah.
whether this E minor symphony might have been partially Florence Price's mink coat.
Yeah. So I will allow that I will allow it in the sense of signifying without a final G, signifying, as a sort of device of a multi-referent, a double entendre. I would allow that the symphony in E minor was a sort of posturing that was important for her in terms of asserting her dominance or skill as an orchestral composer. I will also place that recital moment in conversation because of the risk perceived in using a folk tradition at such a prestigious moment. That to do so was going for broke, as we say. It was putting it all out there at such a prestigious moment. And basically, in the manner of a Dvorak, who you know of as being in relationship with Harry T. Burleigh, Will Marian Cook, in the manner of Dvorak, lifting up the primacy of what indigenous African Americans have been doing for decades. I don't think one has to be elevated over the other. I would say this is her versatility at work, you know? I don't think one needs to be regarded as demonstrating more facility than the other. In fact, I would say it demonstrates competency, knowing your audience, right? And I would say that her audience for that moment in the recital, the 1939 recital, though it was before a predominantly white audience, her audience, the people she wanted to hear themselves, were Black folk. And in that concert hall, they would also hear themselves, but they wouldn't have access. Does that make you? So I don't think there has to be a hierarchy, or which you're not suggesting, but I think that she was demonstrating versatility and competency in a sort of performance theoretical sense. Like she was, yeah.
But I think also that symphony needs to be revived and
Oh, yeah.
paid attention to, because
Oh, yeah.
there's a lot of argument in there.
Oh, yeah.
It's very powerful.
So right now we have a lot of folks who are doing there is a revival. Dr. Kong at University of Arkansas is one of the folks who is at the forefront. She was behind that New York Times coverage last year. Samantha Eeg is finishing up her dissertation. She's in China concertizing around Price's work. There's a cadre of folks who are really focusing on Price right now, especially because more of her material has been unearthed. Yeah, yes. Mm-hmm.
So thanks so much. I saw an earlier version of this you gave at the Marian Anderson.
Yeah.
It's really cool to kind of see the rest of it.
Okay, thank you.
And one thing that I loved was this thing with the coat, and it struck me this intergenerational sisterhood, the homology of the coat to the royalties that are coming down from Marian Anderson performance work. That was just a thought I had. With the
Can I say something about that, though? I struggled to say this because I wanted to be able to, I wanted you all to get the spirit with which I say it. I think of that reading, which again was brought up in 2 recent articles within the last 4 months about the significance of the fur coat. When I finished doctoral research, it was important to my mother that I received and one of her sister's coats. It was important to her that when I completed, I received that. And I as I posted that sort of article on social media, there were several women who spoke of this sort of investiture that occurred that was supposed to mark milestones or the nature of relationships. And so it's a very important detail. I just want to pin on it. And I didn't understand why my mom really felt it deep in her heart that I needed this. I didn't. I was like, I don't. But for her, as a woman who sacrificed a lot, this gesture, I now know, had a resounding significance.
Yeah, no thanks. That's really interesting. My question was at the beginning when you were showing the difference between kind of, or rather, how the documentary fixated so much on kind of like the need for adding value through white men in a sense. You kind of like said in passing, do we even need to have this kind of investiture of value, like be a moment here, a moment there? And so I'm wondering, thinking almost kind of in a meta way, if this theory you lay out about collaboration and Black women's sisterhood and building community in a way that gets around some of these structures of oppression that you've laid out. I wonder if there's a way to think about kind of these concerts, these moments, kind of in a non-narrativizing way, or a way that gets away from like you have to appeal to this or that.
Yeah.
And like is internal to itself in a way that's not very well formed, but I wonder.
No, that's how I prefer to think of it. And it also kind of continues the reflection on the symphony in E minor, in the sense that I'm aware of the tradition that she, Harry T. Burley, Will Marian Cook et al. Were formed under, where one gets an anthology of German art song, French art song, Italian arias and ariettes, and Negro spirituals all in one swoop. It is all value. I learned as a part of the Todd Duncan school, so Porgy and Bess, that guy. That was how the sort of culturally relevant way of teaching formal voice. And so there was no like, you progress to, no, it was you learn all art songs. You will be versatile because you need to eat. They won't always accept you in every, So, and so I appreciate the leveling imagery, and that it can be several moments of joy. Yeah. So I don't think there has to be an apex. I think there could be several moments, especially when we think about issues of sustainability as artists. We can't just have that one blip.
Right.
Yeah. You gotta eat. I love eating, gastromusicology. I didn't see any other hands. Yeah.
I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about maybe some of the things you found in these papers and in the archives. If there was any indication of like writing between Marian Anderson and Thorpe, if after their performance and after the sort of misinformation, particularly your example about how it was reframed as all the sort of narratives that these male announcers are very conveniently overwriting, if they had any conversation, particularly even like humorous conversation, like can you did you hear that this is what the meta narrative is? If you had any indication that they talked about that, or specifically since you were discussing how in the sort of contemporary times it's a really like salient project that women are trying to combat this idea that women are pitted against each other, that with women can't get along, that by strength, just showing these bonds of sisterhood. I'd love to get a sense of whether or not they ever talked about that, particularly because I know I went to a religious all-girls school, and I know we were taught a lot about this sort of, all the sort of religious imagery about lighting candles, and that you don't diminish yourself by lighting someone else's candle, and that was really the overarching message we were taught. But then we would go on admissions tours, and the main narrative that was kind of told was that all-girls school was valuable because you won't have to compete for male attention. Like, you'll have such a better education because divergence from what, you know, they told us the importance of, you know, sisterhood and well, girls' education was. So I was just curious if you know, you had any sense of that for them.
Thank you. So first, well, because I was decentering who we listened to, I did not emphasize what Roosevelt actually did, what Eleanor actually did. There's a lot written about her visual and written detachment from the Anderson issue on purpose. First Lady was known for embracing, like physically embracing black artists at the time. She was known for desegregating, and she was noticeably quiet. Many viewed it being her gesture as allowing the local entities such as Howard, the NAACP, NAM, to take center stage, which is a part of why it was 2 months that she actually, you know, did something that was noticeable about this issue. So I would first take a cue from what people know of the strategy that First Lady did during the time. Also, in terms of marking the moment, one way to look at sort of their regard for each other would be through correspondence, but also through the path of money and the growth in commissioned works between the two. So not only did that bring about notoriety, but it also brought in a lot more domestic performances for Marian Anderson, where she displayed Price's original works. In terms of like an explicit kiki, I haven't found that yet, but I have found the overwhelming gratitude from Price's descendants following that moment. Yeah. Money tells us a lot. You know, even the wire transfer gave a sense of, you know, the nature of their interactions. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys. Thank you all.